It's more complicated than you think. Much more complicated. Much, much more complicated.
Welcome to TaraElla News, where we examine the latest political and cultural news from the perspective of upholding classical liberal values like individual freedom, equal opportunity, and free speech. Subscribe if you're interested. Today, I want to talk about the recent attempt by some fans of both Jordan Peterson and ContraPoints to get the two to have a chat. Jordan Peterson and Natalie Wynn are two of the most influential figures today in the online political discourse, as I discussed a while back in my episode about cults of personality. Furthermore, Natalie's video on Jordan Peterson had a lot of views and was often used to so-called debunk Peterson by the left. It would be interesting to hear what Peterson may have to say on the things Natalie said in that video. Anyway, here are the things I would like to hear if there is ever going to be a ContraPoints versus JBP discussion. Firstly, I think they should go deeper into what Peterson actually means by postmodern neo-Marxism. Natalie stated in the video that this cannot represent a coherent concept because postmodernism is skeptical of grand narratives of history and Marxism has a grand narrative of history. Jordan Peterson has not satisfactorily responded to this point so far, in my opinion. However, I think that Natalie's simple view of the matter is also missing something. I've actually been thinking about this quite a lot in the past year. At first, I sort of defended Peterson because many people seem to know quite well what he means by the term, even if it may be technically incorrect. I also remember seeing a left-wing professor say they sort of agree that what Peterson describes is a thing, even if the terminology may not be correct. But of course, this wouldn't be a good enough way to settle it, so I kept thinking. In April this year, the concept was again revisited during the Peterson versus Zizek debate, where Peterson mentioned something about Foucault, but Zizek simply stated the fact that Foucault was not a Marxist, thus apparently winning the argument. But this really didn't resolve anything. At the time, I made another video explaining that while Foucault was definitely post-Marxist, there are plenty of contemporary, self-identified Marxists who nonetheless use Foucauldian ideas in their activism and even attempt to reconcile Foucault and Marx. I wondered if Peterson meant to describe these particular people with the term postmodern neo-Marxist, which would sort of make sense. I don't think Natalie has ever addressed the existence of this faction of the New Left and how Peterson's term might apply to them. Still, this doesn't resolve whether the term itself could be correct or not. Even more recently, I have come to an alternative hypothesis, that perhaps neo-Marxism was supposed to mean critical theory. The use of this terminology has precedent among academics. I have seen sociology textbooks describe critical theory as neo-Marxism. Or perhaps Peterson was referring to the conflict theory of sociology as a whole, which overlaps quite a lot with critical theory. It would be reasonable to describe conflict theory as neo-Marxism because it was basically rooted in Marxism, even though it is applied to many cultural matters. Either way, because neither critical theory nor conflict theory are necessarily tied to the Marxist grand narrative of history, the incompatibility with postmodernism raised by Natalie is gone. Thus, postmodern critical theory is indeed a thing. There is no inherent incompatibility between the ideas of people like Foucault and Derrida on one hand, and critical theory or conflict theory on the other hand. If Peterson agrees that this is how he uses the term postmodern neo-Marxist, it would be sound. Another thing I would like ContraPoints and JBP to explore is the boundary of what Peterson calls postmodern neo-Marxist, and how it relates to the wider left in general. In her video, Natalie raised the possibility that Peterson could be confused about the wide variation of views in the left-wing politics, and hence lumped conflicting ideologies together. This suspicion isn't entirely without ground, seeing how right-leaning people often misunderstand the left and vice versa. However, if postmodern neo-Marxism is indeed defined the way I suggested, that is, it means either postmodern critical theory or postmodern inspired conflict theory, then so-called postmodern neo-Marxists would represent only a faction of the wider left, and certainly wouldn't include most Democrats, old-school leftists, and the like. With this precise definition, it also becomes practical to mount a sound critique of so-called postmodern neo-Marxists based on a critique around things like social construction theory, structure versus agency, moral relativism, the biological determinants of human nature, the potential paranoia around cultural hegemony, the wisdom of tradition, and the like. This critique wouldn't apply to, and would indeed be entirely separate from, the beliefs of people like Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, Bernie Sanders, Bret Weinstein, and Sam Harris, even if they are generally considered quite left-wing. On the other hand, it will apply very well to some of the politics we see on college campuses today. This would make postmodern neo-Marxism a valid and useful concept indeed. Anyway, I'm not saying that either Natalie Wynn or Jordan Peterson has been thinking in the direction that I'm thinking, but it would be surely interesting to hear their respective thoughts on these matters. That's all for today. I'll be back next time to discuss another big idea. Subscribe if you want to follow our story. The transcripts are available on the internet. And remember to resist the hive mind and stay individualistic. The world depends on it.